Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Scacce Ragusane. That's right, I am very excited to be sharing my first attempt ever for this incredibly unique and delicious Sicilian stuffed flatbread, which I received a request to do not too long ago from one of our Sicilian American viewers. Although it wasn't really so much a request, as much as an offer I couldn't refuse. But anyway, I gave it a try, and for a first attempt I was thrilled with how this came out. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with what's a very, very simple semolina dough. And for that, we will start with some very warm water. And then to that, we will sprinkle over just 1 teaspoon of dry active yeast. And then as usual, we will let that sit for about 10 minutes or so, just to give that yeast a little head start and make sure it's alive. And while we're waiting, we can take a look at the flour we're going to use for this, which as I mentioned is going to be semolina, which I believe is more commonly used to make pasta than it is bread. And as you can see, this has a much more golden look than regular white flour. Plus, the texture is not nearly as fine, so it almost looks more like cornmeal than it does flour. And yes, you should be able to find that fairly easily at any large, decent supermarket. And then what we'll do once we've let our yeast sit in the water for about 10 minutes is go ahead and drizzle in a little bit of olive oil, or preferably Sicilian if you can swing it. At which point we will dump in our semolina, as well as a little bit of salt. And we will start mixing and stirring together with our fingertips to first determine if we need a little more water, which I decided I did. So I went ahead and splashed in a little more, and then continued mixing. And the reason we want to start out kind of dry, and then add more if we need, is because this is not supposed to be a very wet and sticky dough. Okay, this dough is going to be a lot stiffer and firmer than we're normally used to. But anyway, we will keep working that dough until eventually it all comes together into a fairly firm ball we're able to knead. And just as soon as that happens, we'll go ahead and transfer that to our work surface, where we will knead this for about 5 minutes or so. And I'm guessing it was the semolina flour, but even after about 5 minutes of kneading, it did not become super smooth. Alright, I think the texture is going to be much closer to a pasta dough than a bread dough. But anyway, for the initial kneading, I thought I was fine. And then what we'll do at this point is go ahead and cover that with our bowl. And we'll let it rest for about 30 minutes before we give it a second knead. So that's exactly what I did. And after about 30 minutes, there was a little bit of a slight rise to it. And I grabbed it and kneaded it for another 5 minutes or so, before shaping it into a ball, and then dividing it into 2 pieces. And I believe there's 2 ways you can do this step. I think some people divide the dough in half and then knead these little balls for 5 minutes. Or you can do it like I did and knead the whole thing for 5 minutes, and then divide it in 2. But either way, once we have 2 portions, we want to try to form those into a nice smooth ball shape. And to help me do that, because this was feeling a little bit dry, I went ahead and wet my fingers with some nice cold fresh water, which did seem to help smooth out that surface a little bit. And then what we'll do once those are formed is transfer those onto a heavy semolina dusted kitchen towel. And then once placed down, we'll sprinkle some more over the top. At which point we will fold the towel over. And we'll kind of fold over and tuck in the edges, so they're all nice and cozy. And then once we have those tucked in, we're going to let them rise for about 2 hours, or until they double in size, or at least close to it. And after about 2 hours or so, this is what mine looked like. Alright, they had puffed up nicely, and finally did feel kind of soft and supple. And then what we'll do at this point is take one of our portions, and roll it out nice and thin, using just enough extra semolina so it won't stick. And apparently the key is here to get this as thin as you can, which I thought I did a pretty good job of doing. But some of the Sicilian grandmas I watched got it a lot thinner than I did, and you could pretty much see through it. Although in fairness, I'm using a rolling pin, and they were actually using these thinner broomsticks, which I think probably makes it a little bit easier. But anyway, the point is get it at least as thin as this. And once we're done rolling and shaping and stretching, it is time to spread over some sauce and top with some cheese. And what I went with here is just a basic standard pizza sauce that I had added a whole bunch of chopped basil to. And I think it's kind of important here not to spread over too much sauce. Okay, all we want here is a thin layer, going almost but not quite all the way to the edges. And then one sauce, we'll go ahead and top this with some cheese. And since I didn't have access to the authentic Sicilian style cheese they use, which I forget the name of, or I'm just afraid to pronounce it, or both, I'm going to use a nice aged provolone. But what also could work as long as it's low moisture would be like half mozzarella and half grated Pecorino Romano cheese. Or you know what, just use whatever cheese you want. I mean, you are after all the Scacce of your Scacce, and as long as you don't use too much, it should be fine. And then what we'll do once that's been cheesed is fold the 2 longer sides in towards the middle so that they sort of meet in the center. And we'll give that a very, very light pressing, at which point we'll repeat our saucing and cheesing step. And because we're going to fold in both ends towards the middle, I'm going to leave that area in the center cheeseless. And like I said, we will fold both ends towards the middle, just like we did with the first fold, only from the opposite sides. And that's it. To finish this, we'll apply one more thin layer of sauce. But because I'm going to be folding half over the top, I'm just going to put the cheese on one side. And please fight the temptation to be too generous with your toppings, as I think having these overstuffed would be one of the few ways to screw these up, since they might not get cooked all the way through. And then once the last of my toppings was on, I finished by folding the other side over the top, which in hindsight should have come all the way over the top, where the edge was actually touching the table. So I'm definitely going to have to practice my folding, since I think I made this a little too compact and high. But anyway, I pressed on. And speaking of pressing, as I transferred this onto a cornmeal-lined baking sheet, I sort of tried to press and push that side down a little more, so maybe that it would seal a little better near the bottom. But at the same time, I didn't really want to crush this and press it too much. So at a certain point, I stopped and just decided to hope for the best. And I grabbed that pan and transferred it into the center of a very, very hot 500-degree oven for about 16 to 18 minutes, or until very, very well browned. And I was not exactly sure if this looked right, but I did know it looked delicious. And as I turned it around for a little 360 viewing, you can see what I was saying about not having that last fold come all the way over the top. So it's probably sitting up a little too high, at least compared to the pictures I've seen. But then again, I've seen this folded in like a half a dozen different ways. So who knows, maybe I accidentally did it a way some people do it on purpose. In any event, we'll let that sit and cool for about 15 minutes before transferring that onto a cutting board and slicing in. And as I did that, it sure sounded right. And I was sort of thinking at this point, maybe my less than perfect folding technique turned out to be an advantage, since that top crust was nice and crispy. And I have to admit, I was very happy with how this looked. But anyway, looks aside, it was time to go in for a taste, which really was nothing short of incredible. All right, what we have here is a very familiar pizza-like flavor profile, but the delivery system is unlike anything you've ever experienced. All right, the outside crust and edges are crispy and crunchy, while that saucy and cheesy bread dough in the center is much closer to a pasta in texture. So while this is vaguely similar to a lot of things, it is really unlike anything else. Just very unique and unusual in the best possible way. So I found that first piece very easy to eat, and I went ahead and cut a couple more slices, and then did a little bit of food styling with the tip of the knife, so I could position that basil, since I am contractually obligated to take some pictures. And after those, I continued eating and analyzing. And because we roll the dough so thin, and the inside is so moist with that cheese and sauce, I was really afraid that bread wasn't going to cook and it was going to be kind of raw and doughy. But you know what? It really wasn't. Even though it was hard to see here, it was fully cooked. And even though this extremely minimalist approach with the ingredients turned out so well, I don't see why you couldn't sneak a little bit of meat in here. Okay, as long as it was thinly sliced, or if you're using something like sausage finely crumbled. So this is definitely something that would be a lot of fun to experiment with. And believe me, I will be. But having said that, this with just the sauce and the cheese was fantastic. And after enjoying a few slices, the best description I can come up with is this was really like a crispy flatbread, stuffed with lasagna, which sounds kind of crazy, but that's really sort of what this was. So don't be surprised next year when you see a video for something called lasagna bread, based on this recipe. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.